When I opened my grandmother's old letter, which was meant to be her final message, I didn't expect it to set off a chain of events in my life that would shatter everything I thought was unbreakable. My family is not just a group of relatives, but a tight network where every knot has been tied over years, centuries. But with each secret uncovered, with every conversation where I found myself at the center of disagreements, I began to realize that something was wrong, that our life was not a perfect picture, but a collection of carefully hidden cracks, ready to break apart. When Bryce, my brother, lost his flawless mask of confidence, I understood that everything I had grown accustomed to was falling apart, and I didn't know if I would be able to piece together the fragments. How can one live in a world where justice is not just about vengeance, but also about paths to self-understanding? And what do you do when family bonds, which seemed unbreakable, suddenly turn out to be nothing but an illusion? I was rummaging through my grandmother Edna's old cedar chest, which she kept in the attic beneath a pile of dusty blankets. The air was stale, saturated with the smell of aged wood and years of dust that seemed to have seeped into every crack in the house, into every cell of my body. The attic was uncomfortable, small, and hot, despite the late autumn chill outside. There was no light, just a dim glow filtering through a small window, dirty with time. I had volunteered to help my grandmother sort through her things, partly to escape the tense atmosphere downstairs in the house, and partly because I had always loved these forgotten treasures. Grandma kept pieces of the past here, things that seemed to embody entire eras, forgotten stories hidden in old items. When I lifted one of the faded blankets covering the chest, a small envelope slipped out onto the floor. It fell quietly, like a pebble into water, but to me, it was like a fateful sound, echoing in my heart. My breath caught for a moment, and I stared at the envelope in surprise. It was addressed to me, and the handwriting was familiar, elegant, neat, the same I had always seen when Grandma wrote her letters or made notes in her books. I hesitated, unsure whether to pick it up, but then, with a sigh, I bent down and took it in my hands. The weight of its contents seemed to press on me invisibly. For some reason, I felt that the moment I tore open this envelope, it would mark a turning point, as if this letter would open doors to another world. I tore open the envelope, and inside was a letter. I pulled it out and, despite my trembling fingers, carefully unfolded it. The letter was written in Grandma's handwriting, simple, yet at the same time strict and clear. I began to read, and with each line, my perception of the world began to shift. Dear Harper, it's begun. I've been watching you. Like me, you've always sought refuge in things, in old memories, in the shadows of the events happening around you. I hope you never forget that you are a strong and capable woman, despite everything that will unfold. I know that you often lived in the shadow of your brother's achievements, but trust me, this was no accident. He will always be the one in the spotlight, but your path will be more difficult and therefore more important. You will learn to be strong not because you have to, but because you choose to. Sometimes life will seem unfair, but it's in those moments that you will find yourself. My heart raced faster, and I felt the world around me contract. These words, as strange and mysterious as the old things I was rummaging through, seemed to simultaneously generate both darkness and light. They felt so personal, so intimate, as if Grandma was speaking to me, but her voice was distant and intangible, like the memories we carry within us, not knowing how or why. The letter continued, and with each line, my unease grew. Your life will be full of strange twists, Harper. You'll feel that something is wrong. You'll seek answers, but most of them you will only find within yourself. Your decisions will be difficult, and sometimes you'll want to run away, but I ask you, never give up. You will become who you are meant to be. I felt a knot of fear twist in my chest. Something about these words wasn't right. Maybe I wasn't ready for what I had just read. Or maybe Grandma, as always, was trying to teach me something that didn't fit within logic. Deep down, I always knew she had her secrets, but that she would leave me such a message, and now I had to understand it. All my thoughts became a muddled mess, and in hesitation, I turned my gaze back to the envelope, inhaling the smell of old wood and dust once more. The letter weighed heavily on me. I paced the floor, trying to make sense of it all. Inside me, two opposing feelings battled. One, a burning desire to throw the letter in Bryce's face and watch his smug confidence crumble like a house built on sand, the other, equally strong and restraining, making me hesitate. It pulled me back, urging me not to disturb the fragile balance in the family, which, despite all its cracks, was still my only home. I felt as if the letter was an inevitable weight, a burden that was waiting for me to accept it, and in doing so, to take on all the responsibility for its consequences. All the while, I thought of Grandma Edna. Her kind eyes, full of unseen care and a deep, unconditional love. Her gentle smile, which I would remember forever. She was my anchor, my support in a world where everything else seemed shaky and unpredictable. She was the one who always saw me for who I truly was, without hiding behind facades or expectations. In her presence, I didn't feel the need to wear masks. She accepted me with all my weaknesses, anxieties, and doubts. But now, holding this letter in my hands, I felt the weight it carried. Grandma left me not only family relics, not just these objects filled with memories, but something more. It was confirmation of what I had been searching for all these years, my place in this world, proof that I wasn't living in vain in this family, that I wasn't just a shadow, just someone's daughter or sister. But along with that, Grandma left me a huge responsibility, heavy, sometimes unbearable. I wasn't sure I was ready for this. As I lay in bed that night, staring at the dark ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Everything that had happened so far was just a tiny spark, an unknown fire ignited within me, soon to flare up, consuming everything in its path. I thought about the letter, about the words that seemed to echo in my ears long after I had opened it. This letter was the catalyst, the spark that was meant to ignite something greater. I didn't know what it would be, couldn't quite grasp which forces I had now unleashed, but one thing I knew for sure, nothing would ever be the same again. Grandma Edna had written in the letter that she had been watching me, that she always saw how I hid in the shadows, trying to be unnoticed, hiding behind the facades of others. Behind my brother. Behind Bryce. He was always the one in the spotlight, the one whose accomplishments were always celebrated, whose successes were visible, whose mistakes, on the other hand, remained almost unnoticed. I was the one who stayed in the shadows, content with less, always following him but never stepping into the foreground. And the strangest part, I didn't even know if I wanted to. Or maybe I was afraid. Afraid that all my actions would be misunderstood, that I wouldn't be able to live up to the expectations placed upon me. Afraid that, perhaps, deep down, I didn't want to be in the spotlight. After all, from childhood, I was taught that it was important to stay in the shadows, to be unnoticed, to not attract attention. Bryce, in this sense, was like a bright star, impossible to miss. While I was like a faint flame, barely burning, yet still continuing to flicker. Now, as I held the letter, all my doubts began to retreat. My grandmother always knew what was hidden in my heart, that I could be a strong and capable woman if I only decided to. And now, after all these years, it was up to me to decide whether I was ready to accept this role, whether I was ready to step out of the shadows. Or maybe I'd prefer to stay there, in safety, hidden from the world, just as I had done before. Lorraine sighed, her expression softened slightly, but in her eyes lingered a shadow of indecision. She had always been like that, trying to please everyone, avoiding conflict. Her words were like ice water, which only briefly skimmed over my heart, leaving no warmth behind. "We don't want you to feel this way, Harper. It's just that Bryce has always been so driven, and I haven't been," she said, almost justifying him. It was a familiar explanation, as though it explained everything. I felt a sharp pain from their words. Of course, I knew they didn't see me the way I wanted them to, and that this was more an offense to me than recognition of my efforts. I had worked tirelessly too, always trying to meet their expectations. But in this family, it was always him that was seen. Bryce. His ambitions. His victories. He was always at the center of everything, no matter how hard I tried to carve out my place in this world. Every word Lorraine spoke was like a pale excuse to hide the truth. I had never been visible to them, as he was. I was the one who always stayed in the background, who put in the effort, but never received the rewards. The tension in the room became palpable. I could feel it slowly compressing my chest, and for a moment, silence hung in the air. For an instant, it seemed like everyone had forgotten what to say next. Bryce leaned back, his arms crossed over his chest, his gaze cold, as if he already knew what he would say and no longer expected anything new from me. It was like his usual behavior, familiar, meaningless. He was sure that he was always right. "Look, Harper, maybe you're just taking everything too personally," he said, his voice as indifferent as ever. I stared at him, disbelieving, but I wasn't surprised. I didn't need to hear his words to know that, at that moment, he really didn't understand me. He didn't understand how deeply this affected me. I couldn't just accept it. This wasn't just a matter of hurt feelings. This was about justice. It was about being seen. About making my efforts, my thoughts, my feelings, matter. I was tired of being the one who always stayed in the shadows, while all the attention and achievements were taken by him. "This isn't just about me, Bryce," I said bitterly, feeling the words struggle to escape through clenched teeth. "It's about justice, about being seen." My father's jaw tightened. He had always been the one to try to keep the peace. He was always looking for a compromise, but I knew that now he stood between us like a stone wall, not knowing which side to be on. This was the moment when his words couldn't undo what had already been said, couldn't lessen the tension that was building in the room. "It's not like that," he said, his voice almost quiet but firm. "We're all just trying to do our best." But I felt that those words weren't enough. Not enough to ease what had been building for so long. I stood up, the tension in my body not letting go, and I felt my legs begin to move. "Perhaps it was time for you to start seeing the best in me, too." This wasn't a challenge, it was simply a fact that I could no longer hide. I left the kitchen without looking back, my heart pounding in my chest. I heard their voices behind me, but I didn't want to listen. Everything was too loud now, and only the sound of my breathing filled the space. I didn't know where this path was leading me. I didn't know what would happen next. But at some point, when I stopped by the door, I realized that I had a chance. A chance to change something. A chance to become who I should have been all these years. I left the cafe with more questions than answers. The path ahead was more uncertain than ever. Every move I made, every decision now felt like steps in a foggy, boundless ocean, where even the simplest things became complex and ambiguous. But one thing was clear, the story that had unfolded in our house was far from over, and its ending remained hidden in the shadows, barely discernible, like a faint flicker in the night's darkness. In the days following my conversation with Bryce, when I had barely had time to recover, my life turned into a whirlwind of emotions and unexpected revelations. I couldn't shake the feeling that our family was standing on the edge of a cliff, ready to collapse into chaos at any moment. Everything that had once seemed stable and constant now shifted in a fragile shadow, and each new conversation with Bryce or Lorraine brought only more questions and uncertainty. I remembered the time when we could laugh together, when the house was full of the sounds of love and warmth. But now, I felt as though this house had become not just a building, but something unstable, creaking at the seams. Bryce's confession about his financial problems had opened Pandora's box, full of questions, fears, and uncomfortable truths. His vulnerability was like a blow, like an undeserved cold rain that left no chance for defense. He, who had always seemed invulnerable, was no more than a man with the same problems as everyone else. But in that confession, there was something almost intimate, something reminiscent of a confession of weakness, something I had never expected from him. One day, as I was absorbed in preparations for the charity evening, my mind wandered back to that conversation. I became distracted by the memory of Bryce's plea for help. He had seemed so vulnerable, so alien to his usual image, cold, confidently standing on a pedestal. His weakness was so raw that I almost felt like his partner in that moment. But as much as I wanted to help him, part of me felt justified. Bryce, the untouchable, had finally faced the consequences of his actions. The things that might have been hidden behind all his self-assurance and endless achievements. I was a part of this story, a part of the family he had led to this brink. I, too, had made choices. I, too, was involved in this drama, and now, more than ever, it was painfully obvious to me that he could no longer be flawless, that his actions and decisions had led us into this mire. And I couldn't help but feel a slight sense of relief in my heart. As strange as it sounded, Bryce's vulnerability opened up a new space for understanding. I was no longer the shadow he could ignore. The day I arrived at the family home, supposedly to discuss some household matters with my mother, I already knew that the conversation would not be like all the others. The atmosphere was tense, the air in the house heavy, like before a storm. I could feel how the invisible boundary between us, like a wire stretched taut, was pulling apart, ready to snap. We were all, to some degree, participants in this theater, but now I knew the stage had changed. We couldn't go back to the past. The memory of that conversation with Bryce, his confessions and pleas, kept me restless. I knew that my own decisions, my own path, were just beginning to unfold, and they would inevitably intersect with what I had left behind. I was almost through the door when I heard footsteps behind me. My mother peeked around the corner, her face softly illuminated by the dim light filtering through the large windows. We met each other's gaze, and in her eyes, I read the same thing I felt myself. We were all trapped in a closed loop, one that was now slowly tightening around us. I sighed, feeling a mixture of sympathy and irritation. "Bryce, you can't keep hiding this." "It will only get worse," I said, trying to keep my voice calm, but I couldn't hide the growing irritation inside me with every word he had spoken. I knew he couldn't continue hiding behind this facade of confidence, that his world had long been shattered, and that every day spent in silence only worsened the situation. He nodded, but the expression on his face, the pain in his eyes, told me more than words could. I knew he was struggling, that this moment was just as difficult for him as it was for me. But what could I do in this moment? I understood that, despite everything, Bryce was still my brother. Yes, we weren't close, yes, our paths had long diverged, but in his eyes, I still saw that boy I used to play with as a child, the one who had always seemed above all the problems and worries. And maybe that's why helping him felt not only like the right decision but also a duty. "You need to confess, Bryce. To Tessa, Mom, and Dad. It's the only way to start fixing this," I said firmly, though in my soul I felt anxiety. I knew this would open a whole world of uncomfortable conversations and might destroy even more than what was already broken. But there was no other way. He looked at me, his eyes full of vulnerability I had never seen before. It was something new, unfamiliar to me, like the discovery of an unknown land. "What if they hate me for this?" His voice was quiet, almost fearful, like someone who had just realized their own vulnerability. I didn't know how to comfort him, how to say that it wouldn't be so bad. But answering with something reassuring was simply impossible. "They won't hate you," I whispered, "but they need to know the truth." The truth, strangely enough, was the only medicine for all those unsaid words, for the tension that hung in the air like an invisible threat. It was a painful truth, and I knew its revelation would change everything. But hiding it would have been even worse. As we parted, I felt a strange sense of calm. It was as if I had taken the first step on a long journey, one that, despite its fogginess, felt somehow familiar, like an awakening. I had made a decision, I had chosen to act, and that gave me strength. But I knew the road ahead would not be easy, that it would be filled with conflicts and difficult conversations. Bryce and I stood on opposite shores, and now, despite everything, I had to guide him through this turbulent stream, even if I wasn't sure I could endure it myself. Later that evening, as I was wrapping up my day, reflecting on everything that had happened and considering everything that was still to come, I approached my mailbox. It was a typical evening routine. But among the other letters, I noticed an unexpected email. It was from the editor-in-chief of one of the major publications I had discussed writing an article for a couple of months ago. I froze for a moment, not expecting this email right now. Strangely, at that moment, it felt like some kind of sign, a harbinger of something new, though I couldn't quite understand what exactly. I opened the email, and its content almost immediately caught my attention. "Harper, we've decided to offer you the role of a contributing writer for a series of articles for our monthly issue." We believe that your perspective, as well as your unique approach to presenting information, is a perfect fit for our audience. Reading these lines left me with a strange feeling. I wasn't ready for this offer, and despite all my professional confidence, I couldn't shake the thought that it was all happening at the wrong time. It was as though I was being asked to choose between my personal world and the new opportunity being offered to me. Later that evening, I was at home, trying to relax with a glass of wine when the doorbell rang. I got up, walking slowly to the entrance, feeling the tension that had built up over the day still lingering inside me. When I opened the door, I saw Bryce standing on the threshold. He looked more disheveled than I had ever seen him. His clothes were carelessly thrown on, his hair uncombed, and his gaze was so tired that I almost didn't recognize him. "Can I come in?" he asked, his voice sounding as if it had gathered all the weight of the day, now impossible to hide. I stepped aside, signaling that he could enter, though inside, I still carried the heaviness of our last encounter. He walked in, swaying slightly, and sank onto the couch, running a hand through his hair. There was an unmistakable weariness in his movements, not physical, but some internal, agonizing kind. It was as if he didn't know what to do with himself after everything that had happened. "I spoke with Tessa," he said, his gaze distant, as though he was struggling with each word. "I told her everything." I sat across from him, trying to read his face, looking for even the slightest clue about how she had taken it, how she was dealing with it. He exhaled deeply, lowering his head, and I could feel his emotional pain hanging in the air around us. "Not very well," his voice was quiet, almost muffled. "She's hurt, angry, and I don't blame her. But she said she needs time to think." I nodded, understanding the complexity of the situation. Tessa, although strong and independent, must have felt betrayed. It was inevitable. I was here, and I knew how hard it would be for me if I were in her place. But still, despite all the chaos, I felt it was important to say one thing. "At least you were honest with her." "It's a start," I said, with some relief. Bryce looked up at me, and I saw not just exhaustion in his eyes, but a strange mix of desperation and gratitude. He was so vulnerable in that moment that I couldn't help but feel his internal struggle had finally found some form. He was no longer the person he had seen before, uncompromising, confident, someone who controlled everything around him. He was just a man, like all of us, with mistakes and weaknesses. "Thank you for pushing me to do this, Harper. I don't know what will happen, but at least I'm not hiding anymore." His words were like a release, a freedom from something that had been pressing on his chest for so long. I noticed his shoulders relax slightly, as if the burden he had been trying to carry alone had finally fallen. And it was both bitter and painful to see him like this. We sat there, in silence, absorbed in our thoughts, while the heavy silence in the air was almost impossible to break. I couldn't forget that all of this was still just the beginning. Tessa wasn't the only person Bryce needed to address. And I knew this story wouldn't be over until all the mistakes were forgiven, until all the cards were laid on the table. But in this moment, there was something comforting. He wasn't hiding anymore. He wasn't concealing the truth from himself or anyone else. And although a difficult path lay ahead of us, I felt that this was the first step toward healing, not just for his life, but for our family. Still, there was a lingering sense of anxiety, as if an unknown path was unfolding before us, one with no guarantees that everything would return to its place. The gala evening was dazzling. Elegantly dressed guests mingled under the soft glow of chandeliers, and the atmosphere was filled with sophistication. Yet, despite the brilliance and luxury, I couldn't shake the feeling that beneath this glittering surface, something else was lurking, an increasing tension, as if everything could collapse at any moment. People laughed, wine flowed freely, but to me, it all seemed distant and foreign, like a performance where I was playing my role as if on stage. I could feel it on my skin, the weight of this evening, which was becoming more unreal and fragile with every passing moment. In the midst of the celebration, when the sounds of music filled the air and the sparkle of crystal glasses reflected the light, I noticed Bryce and Tessa entering the ballroom. Bryce looked neat, as always, in a sharp suit, his hair impeccably styled, but I could see the tension hidden in his eyes. It was a sign that he was under pressure, a heavy, inevitable pressure. Despite all his outward confidence, his gaze was tense, as if he was holding back a storm inside. Tessa walked beside him, her figure slender in an elegant dress, but her face remained impassive. She wore a mask of calm, and the smile barely touching her lips didn't reach her eyes. I knew her well enough to understand. Her eyes spoke volumes, even if her face remained emotionless. "Harper," Bryce called out as he and Tessa made their way toward me. His voice was slightly higher than usual, carrying a subtle note of nervousness. "Hey, you're here too." I met their gaze, forcing a smile, though something tightened inside me. I responded, trying to sound optimistic, fully aware that there was more behind this greeting than met the eye. "Hi. I'm glad you could make it," I said. Though the words were polite, they felt empty. I noticed Tessa nodding, her face unreadable, but I caught her glance, trying to decipher what she was feeling, how she was processing this moment. "It's a lovely event," she said, her voice quiet, almost detached, as though she wasn't talking about the evening at all but about something else entirely, something unrelated to the world around us. I smiled, though a storm of emotions churned within me. I could feel the tension between us like an invisible barrier that was growing more tangible with every passing second. I needed to say something, to do something to diffuse the atmosphere. But I didn't know what. The words I managed to speak felt hollow, like phrases from a distant past. "Harper, you've done an amazing job," Tessa said, her voice carrying a faint note of gratitude. Yet, she didn't seem sincere. It was politeness, nothing more. I felt a flicker of pride, though it was quickly overshadowed by an inexplicable unease. "Thank you," I replied, trying not to show how difficult this moment was for me. I felt isolated, as though we were all standing on different shores of a river that couldn't connect us, no matter its force. I looked at Bryce and Tessa, knowing something had happened between them. They were in this room, surrounded by all these people, but their shadows followed them, lingering behind every word, every gesture. Tessa was silent, Bryce uneasy. I could tell they had had a conversation that only deepened the divide between them, despite their attempts to maintain appearances. "Despite the tension, I'm glad you came," I said, the words feeling like a small consolation, though I knew no words could restore the balance that had been lost between us. At that moment, I realized my understanding of justice and retribution was shifting. It wasn't just about settling scores or asserting oneself, but about finding a way to navigate the complexities of our family, this tangled labyrinth of relationships and responsibilities. It was about aligning with my values, the very beliefs I had carried with me throughout my life, and, of course, the legacy left to me by Grandma Edna. She had always been the one to teach me resilience and inner balance. She didn't believe in simple answers, but we had always believed in her, her children and grandchildren. That legacy, imbued with wisdom and strength, had become the compass I could use to move forward. As I left the venue, the cool night air hit my face, its freshness hinting at the challenges awaiting me. The wind gently played with my hair, but I paid it no mind. I was consumed by thoughts of how I needed to find a way through all this. The road ahead was uncertain, but I felt ready to walk it. I needed to find a way out of this tangled, unsettling mess that was creeping into our lives more and more each day and emerge stronger on the other side. I felt the weight of obligations, responsibilities, and decisions pressing down on me. But I was ready. The day of Grandma Edna's will reading arrived with a sense of ominous finality. The moment felt so heavy I could almost feel the air around us grow denser, as if the room itself was taking on weight. The family gathered in the old living room, the same room that always smelled of aged furniture, where photographs of our ancestors hung like silent witnesses to the past. Sunlight streamed through lace curtains, leaving delicate patterns on the floor, ephemeral yet beautiful. The space was filled with a quiet, translucent light that seemed to hold countless unsaid words. And yet, the atmosphere was anything but serene. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that every corner of this room held something we had long been avoiding. The gaze of everyone present was taut, like a stretched string. Tessa sat across from me, her face motionless, but her eyes betrayed exhaustion and pain she tried hard to conceal. Bryce, as always, maintained his outward composure, but I noticed how tightly his hands were clasped on his knees, how he occasionally turned his head away, as if trying to avoid seeing what was happening around him. We were all under the heavy weight of inevitability. When the lawyer opened the will, he read Grandma's final words aloud. With each of her sentences, it felt as though time slowed, and everything in that room transformed into something eternal and unavoidable. Grandma had left us not only material possessions, jewelry, books, family heirlooms, but also something far more valuable, memories, a history we were entrusted to preserve. This was her legacy, what she had poured into us, into me, my siblings, and cousins. And I realized that now it was my turn to take on this role, the role of a keeper, someone who would carry forward her work. When the will reading ended, no one spoke. Everyone sat immersed in their own thoughts, trying to understand what they were now tasked with. At some point, I felt all their eyes turn to me. I knew something had to change. I knew this room, these old photographs and scents, they were all harbingers of what lay ahead, that I would have to become the link holding everything together despite the disagreements and hardships. I stood up and looked around. Deep down, I felt how Grandma's legacy had now become my burden, and there was no turning back. I felt empty, the weight of the situation pressing on me, squeezing my chest like an invisible hand. My family was fractured, and I didn't know how to fix it. It seemed like any decision I made would only lead further into the unknown, dragging destruction in its wake. My entire life, all these years, felt meaningless, as though I had always left something unsaid, failed to notice something, unable to recognize it in time. My eyes were heavy with exhaustion, and I couldn't see where I could find the strength to keep fighting for the unity we once considered our duty. Now, that unity felt like a mirage. Later, as I sat alone in the garden, darkness descended upon me, and the enormity of the day loomed over me like an invisible weight I couldn't cast off. The air grew heavier, and I felt as though I couldn't breathe, as if the pain would only intensify with each passing moment. Grandma Edna's legacy, which was supposed to be a source of strength for me, now felt like chains binding me to a world I couldn't comprehend. Broken bonds, old memories, fragments of past words, all of it seemed to lose its meaning in this situation. It was too much. I felt as though I were standing on the edge of an abyss. Everything around me began to crumble, the ground slipping out from under my feet, and I couldn't find anything to hold on to. The sound of footsteps on the gravel path pulled me out of my dark thoughts. I turned my head and saw Lorraine. Her face was calm, but her eyes still bore a trace of sadness that refused to fade. She approached me, her steps soft but deliberate. As always, she had a way of knowing when to step in, to offer support without demanding anything in return. "Harper," she began, sitting beside me on the stone bench. Her voice was quiet, but it carried a strength often hidden beneath her reserved demeanor. "I know this isn't easy for you." I nodded but couldn't trust myself to speak. I didn't want to talk, didn't want to dissect how we had all arrived at this moment. I couldn't identify what I was feeling, bitterness, disappointment, or simply exhaustion. My heart was in turmoil, and I didn't know how to calm the storm within. "Your grandmother loved you deeply," she continued, her voice growing even gentler. "She saw something in you that perhaps the rest of us overlooked." I looked at her, surprised by her words. Lorraine had always been honest and straightforward, and her openness in moments like these rarely left room for misinterpretation. I tried to find comfort in her words, but instead, I felt a deeper unease. "I don't know what to do, Mom," I said, unable to hide my despair. It wasn't just an emotion, it was something far deeper, intangible, that bound me tighter with each passing day. "I didn't ask for any of this." Lorraine looked at me, her gaze distant, as if she were searching for answers in the heavy air around us, in this garden where Grandma and I once sat together discussing life. "None of you asked for this," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "But we're all bound by it, Harper. This isn't something you can just push aside, something you can ignore." I couldn't muster the strength to respond. Everything she said felt simultaneously true and insurmountable. How could one go back and start over when all the steps had already been taken and the consequences were inevitable? We sat in silence, her presence a quiet anchor that seemed capable of keeping me afloat. But I knew that this conversation would be followed by many others, difficult, painful ones, and that the real battle was only beginning. I had been listening for long enough, observing this scene, when it suddenly hit me that it was time to stop being a passive witness. It was time to give voice to my own thoughts instead of simply absorbing the words of others. Tessa's gaze was full of despair, yet there was a fire in it. She loved Bryce, that was clear, but she also knew that love wasn't enough to heal what had been broken. I moved to leave, to give them space, but Bryce, unexpectedly, reached out and grabbed my hand. His grip was firm, as though he was searching for something more in my presence than just support. "Stay, Harper, please," he said, his words carrying a weight that felt more profound than a simple request. I nodded and stayed, saying nothing. Tessa turned to glance at me but still stepped forward. Her eyes held not only pain but also an unyielding determination. She stood in front of Bryce as if testing his strength, his readiness. "Bryce, I love you," her voice was steady, but there was piercing honesty in it, "but I can't do this alone. You need to be honest with yourself and with me." It was almost like a sentence. She spoke quietly, but every word landed with an inevitability, like the strike of a hammer on stone. We all knew this moment was unavoidable, but none of us were prepared for what would follow. Bryce hesitated, and the weight of her words hung in the air, a thread tying them to this excruciating silence. I saw the shadow of fear flicker in his eyes as he grasped the depth of the pain he had caused. And in the moment he tried to speak, the words failed him. He simply stood there, like a man who had completely lost his footing. I could feel his usual confidence, his self-assured armor, retreating with each passing second. "I'm scared," he finally exhaled, and those two words felt too sincere, too vulnerable to belong to a man who had always stood on a pedestal, untouchable, fearless. But in that moment, he was just a man, frightened, lost, and searching for support. Tessa, standing before him, seemed to accept his fear, to embrace it with her own vulnerability. She didn't pull back. Instead, her hands reached out to him with a light that had always been present in her, even in the darkest moments. "I know, Bryce," she said softly, her words worn despite their weight. "But we can face this together." I watched as his protective wall began to crumble. He stood before her, appearing so weak and yet so strong at the same time. It was a moment of absolute honesty, a moment when all the unspoken words and hidden emotions found their way out. I saw how he could no longer hide his pain, his vulnerability. This was a moment of truth, a moment where their worlds collided, intertwining with newfound intensity. It was a turning point, and in that moment, I felt a shift within myself as well. The themes of revenge and justice that had driven me, that had tormented me over the past weeks, seemed to begin dissolving. This was about more than settling scores with Bryce. It was something far deeper. Revenge no longer felt important, and even the justice I had so desperately sought lost its sharpness. I realized that in the tangled web of our lives, amidst all the mistakes and grievances, what truly mattered was not punishment but the possibility of moving forward, of finding a way to restore what had been broken. When Bryce met Tessa's gaze, the vanity and pride that had once defined him were gone. For the first time, I saw him truly looking at her, recognizing that she had been his rock, his foundation, even if he had failed to see it before. And in that moment, I understood that the revenge I had so long pursued no longer held any significance. I could forgive, I could accept, I could move forward, because, in the end, it was the only way to restore harmony within myself and perhaps within this fractured family. I hadn't anticipated that my own journey would be so tumultuous, filled with doubt and anger. The inner turmoil I had experienced over the past weeks was far greater than I had imagined. Yet, despite everything, I had grown stronger. My understanding of the world, of family, of my own boundaries, was evolving. I was becoming more confident in who I was and what I needed to do. And even though the path had been filled with pain and disappointment, I was beginning to see that it was leading me towards something meaningful, something true. One afternoon, as the sun stood high in the sky, gently warming the earth, I found myself back in Grandma Edna's garden. This place had always been my sanctuary, a space where I could momentarily forget the storm raging around me and simply feel alive, connected to something greater than the everyday struggles. The air was filled with the scent of blooming flowers, and sunlight danced on the well-tended roses. I couldn't help but notice how all these elements harmonized, creating a soothing world I had often dreamed of in moments of uncertainty. I knelt down to pull a few weeds that had begun sprouting in the corner of the garden, a reminder that, no matter how much effort we put in, there was always something requiring constant attention. My fingers brushed against something hard, something unexpected, and curiosity got the better of me. I dug a little deeper. My heart froze as I unearthed a small, battered box. It was dusty, as though long forgotten, but it felt incredibly significant. Carefully, I opened it and found a letter addressed to me. Grandma Edna's handwriting was so familiar, so warm and comforting, that it immediately unsettled my fragile composure. My heart pounded as if it knew this box held something vital, something that would alter my perspective. My hands trembled slightly as I unfolded the paper. Grandma Edna's words, her handwriting that I remembered so well, struck me with profound force, like a bomb shattering the calm I had tried so hard to maintain. Dear Harper, it has begun. I've watched you grow with pride and love. You have strength and resilience that will guide you through life's trials. Remember that true recognition comes from within, not from the approval of others. You can be whoever you want to be, but to do that, you need to understand yourself and listen to your desires, not the dictates of the world. I read those lines over and over, unable to believe my eyes. Grandma had always been a source of wisdom and peace for me, her words carried light. But now, holding this letter in my hands, I realized that everything she had taught me was far deeper and more layered than I had ever imagined. This wasn't just advice, it was a reminder that she had always seen something in me that I hadn't seen in myself. She had seen the strength and resilience I might not have recognized within. Her words, spoken with such sincerity and confidence, began to melt away the coldness I had felt in my soul. I could feel the weight that had pressed on my heart for so long start to lift. This letter, this message from the past, became a bridge between me and the path I needed to take. Here, in Grandma Edna's garden, in this place filled with memory and meaning, I realized that despite all the trials and doubts, I had to move forward. I had to not only understand who I was but also accept that the journey to self-discovery is rarely easy. Sometimes, you must take a step into the unknown to find your own way. And though that path was foggy and uncertain, though many storms still lay ahead, I felt ready. I was ready to embrace my responsibility, my strength, and move forward without looking back. Even though there was much more to face, I knew this journey would be mine.